When it comes to beauty that we find within nature, one of the things that is often brought up is the musicality of it. And I'm pretty confident in stating that the poster child for music found within nature is the bird. It is held as this organic generator of music. We often refer to birds as singing. But the funny thing about this is that any biologist would tell you that this singing is simply how they communicate. It's called signaling behavior. From our perspective, they appear to be trapped in some kind of 24/7 musical, but from their perspective, they are just communicating like how I'm communicating with you right now. And I've had the opportunity to live abroad in foreign countries. And when you are in this environment where you are completely unfamiliar with the language, when people are talking around you, it sounds like they are singing to each other in some weird way. Even though the meaning has been removed, there is still natural structure to it. There are natural pauses, breaks, fluctuations in tonality and pitch. It's called syntax. A good example to understanding this concept of syntax is Morse code. I'm sure we have all at least heard of it. Two people can have a full-blown conversation via a series of boops and beeps, because whenever we communicate with each other via verbal language, we are signaling. We are participating in this signaling behavior. We are booping and beeping at each other. It's weird to think about it that way, I know. But the part that interests me is, why is it weird to think about it that way when this process, this concept of signal, appears to be fundamental to nature? And if you actually sit down and think about it for more than 5 seconds, signaling behavior, these two words, signal and behavior, are redundant. All of nature is signaling behavior, or you can invert it and state that nature is the way that signals behave. Nature is signal. It is some kind of network of signals. And I know this word signal may trigger some people. If you want it to sound a bit less schizo, you can say that it's information exchange. That's what it's all about. Everything at every conceivable point is exchanging information with something else. And you'll see that once again, we have returned to this redundancy by using this term information exchange. Just like signaling behavior, information exchange is redundant because information is exchange. You need at least two of whatever it is you are trying to process in order for it to make any sense. Singularness or singularity is barred from our perspective, which is what I covered in my previous video. Once you have at least two, it allows for some kind of dynamic to take place that we call information. Patterns are able to occur. That's what nature is. It is information. It is signal. It is pattern. It is relationships. It is connections. It is exchange, etc., etc. I could go on. And I encourage you to watch my previous videos on this subject. But going into 2025, I want to evolve and push this conversation further, and things may get a bit more schizo. The only question remaining is, how deep does the rabbit hole go? We as human beings view reality as an economy of pattern. There are all of these various kingdoms of patterns. Perhaps normal people don't refer to them as kingdoms. I'm sure most people refer to them as fields of study. However you phrase it, these various fields or kingdoms comprise up what we refer to as human knowledge. But human knowledge has this weird quirk. For whatever reason, this enterprise has been rapidly expanding. And this word expansion that I used is very important, and I used it intentionally because this implies that there is something we are expanding into. This frontier that we are expanding into is literally called the unknown. I refer to it as the mystery. And as I mentioned, as we expand into this domain, we find all of these kingdoms of patterns, these weird, exotic kingdoms of patterns. And these kingdoms have their own domains within them. For example, you can have mathematics. Within that, you can have geometry. Within that, you can have topology. And these are all things that seem obvious enough because we have the luxury of them already being solidified within human understanding. The key takeaway here is that expansion into this domain, this frontier of the unknown, and the acquisition of pattern apprehension, pattern recognition, it appears to be some kind of indistinguishable process. To put this all very simply, learning is pattern recognition. It is the apprehension of pattern. And I'm sure most of you listening already knew that. I have talked about this previously. But the catch here is that, just like this word expansion, recognition is the key word. Expansion implies that the pattern is already there and you are discovering it for the first time. Recognition implies that the pattern is already there and you are seeing it for the first time. So taking this into consideration, these two fundamental categories that we place reality into of being the known and unknown, you can view them as being pattern and unrecognized pattern. From our perspective, these are the two primary categories of reality, patterns and unrecognized patterns. We see within chaos theory that there is a such thing as patterns that we don't recognize. So it's not like I'm grasping at straws here. And all of this seems simple enough, but it actually raises several very difficult and complex questions like, how are we able to perceive new patterns and why are we able to see certain patterns and not others? Those two questions are similar, but not quite the same. And most importantly, as I mentioned, how deep does the rabbit hole go? If you view the unknown as a map, with the known being locations on it, just how big is this map and where are we located on it? What kinds of patterns are out there that we are just completely unaware of? Because you see, one of the things that people have become out of touch with is the timeline of us as a species. We have been on this planet for millions of years. And people believe that over all of these millions of years, we just progressively got smarter as a species because that's just how brains work. But that's not how nature works. That's not how it works at all. Species don't just become smarter over time. Alligators, all of these prehistoric species, they're all pretty much the same from how they began. Something happened with us where we just started noticing patterns everywhere. Patterns that were once invisible to us began to become apparent. And everyone who studies this all agree that it has something to do with language. It's like how I started this video. Once we tapped into this primary pattern of language, this primary signal, it began to expand out into other domains of patterns, into other languages. And this occurred not that long ago. And this principle of language expanding into other kingdoms or domains of patterns, it appears to be written on the very fabric of life itself. When you look at DNA, that's what DNA is. It is language. It is code, genetic code. It is this living language that expanded into all of these different domains of patterns that we refer to as life on this planet. That somehow, some way, you can start off with nucleotide pairs and end up with jazz, end up with Dave Brubeck. And as I previously mentioned, this all raises several questions that don't really have an official answer, such as, how are we able to see new patterns and why do we see certain patterns and not others? How does the invisible become visible? How are we able to learn? The phenomenon of learning doesn't make much sense, and it is paradoxical in nature. Knowledge, in and of itself, shouldn't be able to change. In order for it to do so, it would have to pull itself up by its own bootstraps, essentially. But still, it somehow does it. And the current explanation of this is that it just does it on its own. Within science, we call life self-organizing. When describing the nature of knowledge, I have used all kinds of synonymous terms. I have used information. In this video, I've also used signal, relationships, and I've also used this term connections. We are learning via neuroscience and, surprisingly, computer science via neural networks that we learn by connections. Your brain is literally making connections. It is becoming ever more interconnected with itself, and it is reinforcing these connections, and we call these neural pathways. However, this is very paradoxical because we don't know how it's able to do that. Notice that I said how it's able to do that. We can explain how it does it, but how it's able to do it remains a mystery. This is why there is this huge gulf, this huge separation between organic intelligence and what we call artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence winds up being degenerative. You can sort of think of it as being this solid structure that can never change unless we go in and engineer said change. Things can bounce around within this structure in all kinds of weird and wonky ways, but the structure itself cannot change on its own. This is why AI can take everything that we already know and do it way better than us, perhaps even perfectly. But it cannot create anything new, at least not right now. Because in order for it to do so, it would have to be able to dynamically change its own inner workings. Similarly, your brain is like that. Our brains are like this, but for whatever reason, they are able to change. There is some strange factor that is acting upon the brain that is allowing it to not be stuck or trapped inside of its own understanding. It gives this structure plasticity. This is what we call it, neuroplasticity. Thousands of years ago, our ancestors via mysticism, they call this divine intervention, that somehow, some way, this is all linked to divinity. We are able to learn via some kind of divine grace. If you are a more modern rationalist, you just call this the outside world, the outside factors. The scientific explanation is that there are environmental pressures that impact our internal brain circuitry. But the ironic portion about this is that this term environmental pressures isn't very scientific at all. This term pressure has a real quantifiable definition. You can express pressure as pounds per square inch or something like that. But this word environmental pressure in the context that is used is closer to poetic language. It's like saying the weight of responsibility. Obviously, responsibility has no physical, tangible weight. Whether you want to call it environmental pressure or divine intervention, I think that it is this attempt to articulate the same thing. It is the facilitation of this proverbial eureka moment. It's like capturing lightning in a bottle. I'm sure many of you have heard the story of Archimedes and the discovery of buoyancy. Was that external environmental pressures, or was it divine intervention? In my previous video, I described it as an intersection from some other dimension that presents itself to us as chaos or some kind of change. And I think that a good way of conceptualizing this is computers, digital information, going back to computer science. We as human beings give computers all of the information that they have. It all comes from us. We give them this information and also instructions on what to do with it. Even if computers were somehow able to become sentient and make their own decisions, they would still be restricted to the information at their disposal and the emergent properties that arise from that. So as a result, this world of digitized information is a closed system. It isn't until us, human beings, it isn't until we interface with this system, until we intersect with it, that we can input new or novel information that is ultimately able to change this solid structure that we call the world of digitized information. We quite literally exist in a different dimension than this world of digitized information, the somatic world, the world of phenomenology, the biological world, however you want to phrase it. We are this chaotic intersection that is interacting with this closed system. And I believe that our reality, our waking world, is a result of this thing that I'm describing, some kind of intersection from some other dimension. I don't know if it's a higher dimension, an adjacent dimension, or if it even has a location, if location even makes sense when talking about these kinds of things. But there is something that we are not able to perceive that is causing new things to happen. And this segues perfectly into the next question of what kinds of patterns are out there that we are just simply not able to perceive? There could be all kinds of things going on around us that are completely invisible to us. Not only do I believe that reality is weird, I think that it is really weird, really strange. For example, we can look at bees. What if bees actually did have some kind of hive mind or overmind? As a matter of fact, I think that this is what most people actually believe. The rationalist types, the types that have pretty much taken over the institution of science, they argue against this. They say that this is all just foolishness, and this complex colony behavior is some kind of emergent property of the way that individual bees behave. But this word emergent property is meaningless. I've talked about this before. It's just a word that is used when they can't explain how something happens, why something comes into being. You as a human being, a thinking, art-producing human being is just an emergent property of your organs working together. But in this case, everything is an emergent property of everything else, because what information is exchange. Whenever two things form a relationship, whenever two things connect, something emerges from that, and we don't know why. We call it an emergent property. However, most normal, naturally thinking people can just intuit that there is some kind of higher organizing structure, some kind of higher factor that is at play. And we all naturally intuit that there appears to be some kind of hive mind. I mean, this is a very Jungian way of putting it, this implication that there is some kind of collective overmind of a species. Bees obviously are a prime example of this kind of situation, but this means that whenever you look at a beehive, for example, you are looking at the physical brain of this factor. We don't see the overmind. We just see its naked brain, the beehive. The same way that if I were to look at your naked brain, I wouldn't be able to see you. Who you are is a bit more complicated than that. I could probably tell certain things about you by analyzing your brain, whether or not you were under stress, whether or not you were sleeping or bored or exercising. But what you actually are, who you are, would be invisible to me. There could be all kinds of different phenomena, domains of information, patterns, different levels of organization or intelligence that are surrounding us on a moment-to-moment basis that we are completely unaware of or not able to perceive, that are intersecting with us. It's kind of like the field of microbiology. We really take for granted just how new all of this stuff is. It's only been about 200 years that we have even known about this kind of stuff. You know, the plague mask, the famous beaked mask that people would wear during the bubonic plague? This was because they believed that this infection was spread by smell. They thought it was the smell that made you sick. Not the bacteria. There was no such thing as bacteria, but the actual bad smell that made you sick. So they would put things that smelled nice within this mask to ward off the sickness. I've taken more microbiology courses than I care to admit, but when you learn about the history of this field, the way that we used to do surgeries and just our complete disregard for microbiological factors, this was because although it was intersecting with us, it was impacting our human world, our human reality. We had no idea it was there. In certain circles, there were people reasoning and theorizing that there may be some other factor that we aren't considering, kind of like how I talked to you about this overmind of the bees. But there was really no proof, no real evidence, and people would just say that you're cuckoo, you're a bit out there. It wasn't until the technology changed, it wasn't until the technology admitted or permitted direct observation via the microscope that humanity discovered, there's that word again, discovered, that they are being intersected by this entire kingdom of patterns, this entire kingdom of these different intelligent life forms. We even see this with physics, this holy grail of science as it's hailed. We went from not knowing anything to discovering all of these fields, the electric field, the magnetic field, gravitational fields, tensor fields. Have you ever asked yourself, what exactly is a field? A field is just a domain of potential interactions. It is just a domain of information. It is a kingdom of patterns. And I believe, when applying Occam's razor, I believe that it is more likely than not that this trend continues, this trend of all of these different kingdoms of patterns. It's just that this trend continues in ways that aren't obvious to us. And the way that we are supposed to think in this current social paradigm, you aren't supposed to do this. It's called an appeal to ignorance, that just because we can't prove it to be false, that doesn't mean that it's true. But the entire enterprise of human understanding is ignorance in its appeal to us. If you look at the bulk of what I cover on this channel, it is our relationship with ignorance. There is something about the unknown that really has us in this weird psychological bind. And I believe that we are indeed psychologically bound by something. I meant it in a literal sense. And this thing that we are bound by is language. It's like how I started the video. And when I use this term language, it isn't just me talking to you right now. It has something to do with the way that we fundamentally view reality, the way that we perceive pattern, the way that we process signal. This is what language is. Or in other words, we live in some kind of framework where everything has to be able to be explained. If we cannot explain it, then we cannot perceive it. It's just as the quote from Mephistopheles says, that man can only grasp those thoughts which language can express. If something doesn't have a perfectly logical explanation, then it is quite literal nonsense. It doesn't make any sense to us. Or to put this all simply, magic cannot be real. I'm sure many of us have heard the famous quote that a sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Most people don't think about what that implies, that we view magic, this thing that we call magic, we view it as something that we haven't yet explained. We view the unknown as patterns not yet recognized. And what language is, what knowledge is the collapse of magic into patterns, the collapse of magic into what we call useful information. But here's the catch. Magic is real. As a matter of fact, our entire universe appears to be powered by it. And for you rationalist types that think I'm talking about some sort of woo-woo Harry Potter nonsense, you believe that magic is real too. You just call it something else. You refer to it as entropy. Entropy is what makes the world go round. quite literally. And for those of you who don't know, entropy is the measurement of randomness in any given system. What randomness is, it is the lack of pattern, the lack of information, the lack of knowledge, the lack of language. People think that entropy implies the end of all activity, but entropy is the end of all activity that makes any sort of sense. This is what magic is. Activity that defies explanation, that cannot be explained. This is what randomness is. And now we don't have to just depend on so-called woo-woo mysticism to come to this conclusion. We can see that this is what the universe is powered by. This is the fundamental backdrop to everything. We view this entropic randomness as a bad thing, as something to be avoided. I mean, technically it is pulling the universe apart. But it's actually what gives everything its meaning. It's like the tension on a guitar string. If you have a guitar string with no tension and you pluck it, nothing will happen. It will just maintain whatever form that it took whenever you touched it. This is this eternal state of pattern. I believe that this is what reality fundamentally is. It is this natural state of eternality, of self-reference. It isn't until you add tension and pluck it that you get music, you get sound. You can also view it from the other angle that if you imagine a world without entropy and you have this tense guitar string and pluck it, it will just vibrate at the same frequency forever. It will maintain, a C sharp forever. And for whatever reason, this eternalness, this same frequency in this repetitive state, it disappears. It sort of fades into the background. It is entropy that causes this note to diminish over time. And it is this diminishing over time that makes music possible. It is what gives it its meaning. Entropy is what causes things to be imperfect. It is a slide into what we perceive as imperfection. However, this appears to be the driving force to everything, the universe, life itself, whether this is imperfect DNA transcription causing genetic mutations that fuel evolution. It's as I stated in the beginning of the video that behavior is signal. It is something that makes sense. And we can now see that behavior is entropy in disequilibrium. It is something that is being slowly pulled into entropy. Or to phrase it more poetically, the only reason that we live is because we eventually kicked the bucket. If you somehow were able to maintain these biological processes forever, you would cease to be alive. Your metabolism would disappear and you would become something else. You'd be some kind of angel, some kind of deity. I have no idea. But there is a weird problem. If entropy is the tension and the vibration of the string is reality as we know it, what is doing the plucking? What is enjoying the music? This is a very old problem. It's back to the old hard problem of consciousness. What is the observer, or who is the observer? This is why metaphysics is so important to me and why I tend to focus on consciousness. This runs hand in hand with this ultimate question of why is there something instead of nothing? How is this possible? Science will just point us back to the Big Bang. At best, we've been able to theorize that perhaps before our Big Bang, there were several others. But this initial point, this quote unquote first mover, this is the big mystery. And this can only really be tackled by metaphysics. This is what interests me. This is kind of how I choose to take the direction of this channel. And instead of a single observer, reality appears to be a network. It is this ecology of observers. There are all of these different kingdoms with their own unique perspectives, their own unique languages, their unique ways of exchanging information with each other, their own unique signaling behaviors. And God, if you want to call it that, is the totality. It would be what these rationalist types describe as an emergent property of all of the commotion going on within reality. I just personally believe that the commotion going on within reality is a lot more vast than what we think. It is more than just this biological domain. I think that it's more likely than not that reality is more complicated than it appears to be. It's already complicated enough with what we can observe. I think it goes further than that. For example, within physics, there are quantum vacuum fluctuations. Oftentimes within physics, things can go in and out of existence. Factors can annihilate each other and disappear out of existence, but I don't think that there is a such thing as being out of existence. I think they just go to some place that we cannot perceive. It's like when you play peekaboo with a baby, whenever you hide your face, they literally think that you disappeared. It's like that with us. There is some kind of veil that we cannot see through, and we call this structure the universe. And I think that this all has something to do with language, the way that we apprehend pattern. For our perspective to work, we have to see patterns as things that are closed off. I don't mean literally, cars are a pattern, but you can open the doors on it. I mean, there is a certain logical closure to it. It is defined. And it is this need for closure that creates this veil that we can't see through. A prime example is entropy. Entropy is the measurement of randomness in any given system, but you'll see that this word system isn't what we think it is, and I believe that it has more to do with metaphysics than actual physics itself. Virtually anything can be a system. Your cells, your stomach, your heart, you, a tree, your PlayStation. Anything that experiences time can be a system. And this process of assigning things as being a system or not is an exercise in language. This is what language is. It is to make patterns, to make an object out of the chaos of reality. So in essence, describing something as being a system is the same as describing something as being a thing, because that's what a thing is. It is a system. It is pattern. As soon as something ceases to be a pattern, it ceases to be a thing, and it becomes magic. It becomes invisible to us. It's something that doesn't make sense. And we have extended language out into these various domains of patterns until language begins to fail us. For example, I can look at one of your white blood cells and determine it to be its own closed entropic system. Or I can open it up and just talk about your immune system, which encompasses your white blood cells. Or I can talk about you being your own system, which encompasses your immune system. I can talk about the planet, then the solar system. Anything that uses energy can be described as its own system. And we just go out and out until we can't see any further, and we call this structure the universe. It appears to be infinite with no openings. This is the standard way that it's viewed. And it is this portion here, the no openings portion. The way that you respond to this will ultimately determine if you are going to go with the status quo or if you're just going to be labeled as crazy. Saying that it's infinite with no openings is the same as saying that it's closed. And many people theorize that it's some kind of toroidal shape or it folds back in on itself or something like that. But as soon as you try and close the universe, things cease to make sense. The universe literally becomes the universal set within set theory, the set that contains all other sets, including itself. This is something that just simply cannot exist according to our logic. I think that this is all just some huge contrivance of language. I mean, when you look at Gödel's incompleteness theorem, this supposedly proves that logic is inherently incomplete. There is no such thing as full logical closure. Everything always has some kind of opening. And this structure that we refer to as the universe is just this huge logical object, and perhaps it is open in some way, just not open in a way that is obvious to us. It isn't open in a way that makes any physical sense. And I guess this is the most schizo or delusional part of this video, because I believe that it's most likely this opening that doesn't make physical sense. It can only be in the only part of the universe that doesn't have to make physical sense, the imagination. I think that once you begin to humor giving the imagination a true ontological status, you tap into something. You begin using some hidden organ that we have that I call the third eye. I named this channel after it. And this imagination isn't really about rainbows and unicorns and some kind of fantasy land. For you more rationalist types, you can think of it as some kind of field. And this field is intersecting with us. This is this weird, chaotic intersection that I'm referring to, and perhaps this is where everything originates from. You can sort of conceptualize this whole many worlds idea, these varying timelines, as some kind of logic applied to this field of the imagination. The imagination is some kind of field of possibilities, with each timeline being a representation of a possibility. It is like locations of the known on a map of this giant space of the unknown that I call the imagination. And when you actually do some digging, you'll see that this concept isn't new. Philosophers have been talking about this for quite some time. Before there was a string theory, the philosopher Leibniz mentioned how he believed God chose from all of these infinite realities and chose the best one. He decides the best one. And it's funny, I really don't have to try and convince you, because I know that you already believe what I'm talking about. It just sounds crazy when you hear it from someone else, and perhaps I enjoy sounding crazy. We are all taught about this in science class. It is the principle of stored energy. Stored energy is extremely important to our understanding of the physical universe, but what stored energy is completely hypothetical. Certain conditions have to be realized for this energy to manifest and be useful. It is, in other words, completely imaginary. If you create a device where you press a button and it releases enough energy to destroy the planet, you create all of these different scenarios. You have scenarios where the energy remains stored, and you have scenarios where the button is pushed and Armageddon breaks loose. If you want to call that some kind of alternate timeline, go right ahead, but I think that calling them timelines doesn't quite do it justice. We like to pick these breakpoints where the timeline splits. If you decide to get married or not, or if a particle spins up instead of down, the timeline splits. But I personally believe that there are a lot more splits or junctions or decisions being made than we can be aware of. Now, if you want to call this alternate timelines, parallel realities, some kind of cosmic computer running an infinite amount of different simulations, the mind of God, take your pick out of all of them. But there is some kind of state where all possibilities that could possibly be possible exist. And it is a state where anything is possible. And I don't know how else to describe that other than being magic, which sounds a whole lot like how I explained entropy to be earlier in this video. And to wrap this video up, because I am quite tired of talking, this X factor, how it all comes full circle. This X factor appears to be life. Life appears to be trying to persist in the face of entropy. But it is persisting towards something. There is a purpose. There is a telos, some kind of omega point. Life is like this seed, and its roots are rooted down within entropy, and it is growing up towards something. It is trying to become the perfect possibility. But it can only grow as fast as it can learn, and it learns by recognizing more and more patterns, these domains of patterns, by processing more and more signal. But I am going to end this video here. It has gone on quite long enough. Please do all of the things that YouTube asks you to do, like the video, comment, subscribe to the channel. And if you can take anything from my ranting, anything from this video, it should be that learning is a lifelong process. It's something that shouldn't be taken for granted. I'm sure many of you are seeing that your employers are requesting this from you. What we need now is more unique insight. We need people who are able to see different types of patterns. With the rise of AI, one of the most in-demand skills, ironically enough, is creativity. All of these specialized skills are being replaced by machines that can do them perfectly. But the one thing that can't be replaced is the one thing that has been devalued throughout recent history. This is our ability to be creative, our ability to gain unique insight. But this journey into insight, this creative process also means that you're going to wind up sounding crazy. This is the life of an artist, to live on the outskirts of the cultural hallucination. But that's the subject of a different video. I'm going to end the video here. And until next time, y'all have a blessed day.